Recently, I discovered a really odd fear that I have. The fear of finding unexpected objects in my food. It's not so much a fear of contamination or getting sick, but more so a fear of being caught off guard by something unexpected while eating. It's a bit ridiculous, but it's become a bit of a running joke with my friends and family. Whenever we go out to eat, they always tease me about it and make sure to warn me if they see something unusual in their food. It's silly, but it's also become a lighthearted way for us to bond over our quirks and insecurities. Recently, I discovered a strange fear of mirrors. It's not that I'm afraid of my own reflection, but rather the idea that something might appear behind me in the mirror when I'm not looking. This fear is called isoptrophobia, and it's been making me feel uneasy whenever I'm around mirrors. I never thought I would develop such a fear, but it's interesting to learn about the different phobias that people can have. Have any of you experienced anything similar? Have you ever heard of nomophobia? It's a fear of being without your mobile phone or not having access to a cellular network. It's a relatively new phobia, coined in 2010, and it's becoming increasingly common. In today's smartphone-dependent world, people with nomophobia experience extreme anxiety or panic when they are separated from their phone or when the battery is low, and they feel like they are missing out on something important. Some individuals even report physical symptoms, like sweating, shaking, and increased heart rate when they can't access their phone. The phone seems to be in my hands, ugh. Have you ever experienced an intense and irrational fear of something that others find completely harmless? That's me, and my fear is not only strange but also embarrassing to admit. I have a fear of cotton balls. Yes, you read that right, cotton balls. I can't touch them, hear the sound of them, or even think about them without feeling incredibly uncomfortable. It's as if they're crawling all over me, and the sensation is unbearable. I remember one time when I had to get a routine medical procedure done, and the nurse used a cotton ball to clean the area before inserting the needle. I almost passed out from fear and had to ask her to use an alternative method. I'm sure she thought I was crazy. I've tried to overcome my fear by exposure therapy, but it's just too difficult for me. Even seeing someone else touch a cotton ball is enough to trigger my anxiety. I know it sounds ridiculous, and I wish I could just get over it, but it's something I can't control. It's comforting to know that I'm not alone, and that other people have strange fears and phobias too. I have a story to share about a strange fear that I experienced. It happened a few years ago when I was on a road trip with some friends. We were driving through a mountainous area and had to stop at a gas station to fill up. As I was walking towards the convenience store to buy some snacks, I noticed a large group of crows perched on the roof of the building. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I got closer, I started to feel a sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I was overcome with a feeling of intense fear and anxiety. I tried to shake it off and continue into the store, but I found myself frozen in place, unable to move. My friends noticed my hesitation and came over to see what was wrong. I tried to explain the feeling, but it was difficult to put into words. I just knew that I couldn't go any closer to the crows, and I wanted to get back in the car and leave as soon as possible. After some convincing, my friends were able to get me into the store and distract me from the crows. However, the fear stayed with me for the rest of the trip, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease whenever I saw a group of crows. I later found out that there is actually a phobia called corvidphobia, or fear of crows, which is relatively uncommon. While I don't know if that's exactly what I experienced, it was definitely a strange and unsettling feeling that I hope to never feel again. My strange fear that I might drown in a puddle. Hey guys, I wanted to share my strange fear that has been haunting me lately. It's something that might sound silly, but it's been really affecting me. So, I've always been a bit of a hypochondriac and prone to anxiety, but this fear is something new. Recently, I've developed an intense fear of drowning in a puddle. Yes, you read that right, a puddle. It all started when I was walking to work, and there was a particularly large puddle on the sidewalk. I had to walk around it, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going to somehow trip and fall face first into the water. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I couldn't get the thought out of my head. Since then, every time I encounter a puddle, no matter how small, my heart starts racing and I feel like I need to walk as far around it as possible. I've even started carrying an umbrella with me everywhere I go, just in case it starts to rain and I need to protect myself from any potential puddles. I know this fear is irrational and unlikely to happen, but it's been causing me a lot of distress. I've tried to reason with myself and tell myself that I'm being silly, but it hasn't helped. I even had a nightmare recently where I fell into a puddle and couldn't get out. Has anyone else experienced a fear like this? Or am I just completely alone in my strange phobia? Any advice on how to overcome it would be greatly appreciated. I recently discovered a strange fear that I never knew I had. One day, while browsing through social media, I came across a post about the deep sea and its various creatures. As I scrolled through the images of bizarre and otherworldly creatures, I suddenly felt a sense of dread and anxiety wash over me. It was then that I realized I had a fear of deep sea creatures. The thought of being in the depths of the ocean with these strange and frightening creatures is enough to make my heart race and my palms sweat. Even looking at pictures or videos of these creatures sends shivers down my spine. I never thought I had a fear of the ocean, as I enjoy swimming and have been on boats numerous times. But the idea of being in the deep sea with these creatures is a whole different story. I know it sounds irrational, as the likelihood of encountering these creatures in everyday life is slim to none, but the fear is still there nonetheless. I try to avoid looking at images or videos of deep sea creatures now, as it only serves to trigger my anxiety. Who knew that something so far removed from my daily life could elicit such a strong emotional response in me? It all started when I was out with some friends at a local amusement park. We decided to go on a ride that spins you around really fast, and as we were waiting in line, I started to feel really anxious and nervous. At first, I thought it was just normal jitters from going on a thrilling ride, but as we got closer to the front of the line, my heart started racing and my palms became sweaty. When it was finally our turn to get on the ride, I panicked and had to step out of line. After that experience, I started to realize that I have a fear of spinning. It sounds silly, but even watching videos or seeing pictures of things spinning can trigger my anxiety. I've never experienced anything like this before, and it's been really challenging to cope with. I've since learned that this fear is called phobia, which is the fear of buttons. While it may seem odd and irrational, it's a very real fear for some people. I've also discovered that this phobia can sometimes be linked to sensory processing disorders or traumatic experiences. Overall, it's been a strange and unexpected discovery, but I'm learning to accept and manage this fear as best I can. It's definitely made me more aware of the different fears and phobias that people can have, and how they can impact our daily lives. I have a story to share about a strange fear or phobia that I recently discovered in myself. It all started when I was on a family vacation in the countryside. We rented a cabin near a small lake, surrounded by dense woods. It was a beautiful location, and we were all excited to spend a few days exploring the outdoors. On the first day, we decided to take a hike through the woods to get a better view of the lake. We packed a picnic lunch and set off on the trail. It was a hot day, and we were all sweating. By the time we reached the top of the hill overlooking the lake, we found a shady spot to have our lunch and enjoy the view. As we were eating, I noticed something moving in the bushes nearby. At first, I thought it was a small animal, but as it emerged from the brush, I realized it was a large spider. I froze in fear, and my heart started pounding in my chest. My family members were surprised by my sudden reaction and tried to calm me down, but I couldn't shake off the fear. From that moment on, I became hyper aware of the possibility of encountering spiders or other creepy crawlies in the woods. Every time we went for a walk or a hike, I found myself scanning the ground, bushes, and trees for signs of spiders. I started imagining scenarios where I would get bitten by a venomous spider and have to be rushed to the hospital. Even when we returned to the cabin, I couldn't relax. I felt like the walls were closing in on me, and every shadow held the potential for a spider to appear. I couldn't sleep at night, and my anxiety levels were through the roof. It wasn't until we left the cabin and returned home that I started to feel like myself again. I realized that my fear of spiders had become a full-blown phobia, and it had taken over my life for a few days. Since then, I've been working on facing my fear and trying to desensitize myself to the sight of spiders. It's a slow process, but I'm determined to overcome this irrational fear and enjoy the outdoors without constant anxiety. A few years ago, I started to develop an irrational fear of bridges. It began when I was driving across a particularly long and tall bridge during a road trip. As I approached the bridge, I felt a sudden rush of fear and anxiety. My heart began to race, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Despite my fear, I managed to drive across the bridge safely, but the experience left me feeling shaken. After that day, I noticed that I started to feel anxious whenever I had to cross a bridge. It didn't matter how small or large the bridge was. I would always feel a sense of dread and fear. I even started to avoid certain routes that required me to cross bridges, which made driving to certain destinations more difficult. The fear became so severe that I began to have panic attacks whenever I had to cross a bridge. My heart would race, and I would break out in a cold sweat. I even started to imagine worst-case scenarios, like the bridge collapsing or my car careening off the edge. I knew that my fear was irrational, but I couldn't seem to shake it. I tried deep breathing exercises and visualization techniques to calm myself down, but they didn't work. Through therapy, I learned coping mechanisms and techniques to manage my fear. I also gradually exposed myself to bridges, starting with smaller ones and working my way up to larger ones. Over time, my fear subsided, and I was able to cross bridges without experiencing panic attacks. When I was younger, I used to have a really intense fear of bees. It wasn't just a normal dislike or wariness around them, I was genuinely terrified of them to the point where I would become paralyzed with fear if I saw one buzzing around. I remember one particularly traumatic incident when I was about 7 years old. I was playing outside with some friends when a bee suddenly appeared and began flying around my head. I immediately froze, unable to move or even scream for help. The bee eventually landed on my arm, and I could feel its tiny legs crawling across my skin. I remember feeling like I was going to faint, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Thankfully, my friends were able to quickly shoo the bee away and I was unharmed. But from that moment on, my fear of bees only intensified. I would avoid going outside during the summer months, and if I did venture out, I would constantly be on high alert for any signs of bees. I would even get nervous around pictures of bees in books or on TV. It wasn't until I was a bit older that I was able to start overcoming my fear. I began reading books about bees and learning more about their behavior and how they contribute to the ecosystem. I've always been terrified of heights. I can't even climb a ladder without feeling dizzy and nauseous. But a few years ago, my friends convinced me to try bungee jumping. I was terrified, but I didn't want to let my fear control me, so I jumped. It was one of the most exhilarating experiences of my life, and it helped me realize that sometimes we need to face our fears in order to overcome them. I've always had a fear of germs, and it only got worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. I was constantly washing my hands and sanitizing everything around me, but eventually, my fear became so intense that I couldn't even leave my house without feeling anxious. I knew I needed help, so I started seeing a therapist who specialized in treating phobias. With her guidance, I was able to confront my fears and learn coping strategies to manage my anxiety. These are just a few examples of the many stories on Reddit about fears and phobias. It's important to remember that everyone experiences fear at some point in their lives, and seeking help and support can be a powerful tool in overcoming it. I never really thought of myself as a particularly fearful person. I mean, I have my share of anxieties like most people, but nothing too out of the ordinary. That was until I discovered my strange phobia, a fear that I didn't even know existed. It all started one day when I was at the beach with some friends. We were all having a great time playing frisbee and swimming in the ocean when, suddenly, I felt something brush against my leg. It was just a small, harmless wave. I thought to myself, but then something weird happened. My heart started racing, my palms started sweating, and I felt like I was going to pass out. I had never felt anything like that before. At first, I thought it was just a fluke, a weird momentary panic attack, but then it kept happening. Every time I went near the water, I felt this overwhelming sense of terror. It was like something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to grab me and pull me under. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away, but it just kept getting worse. Even the thought of the ocean or any large body of water made me feel sick to my stomach. I couldn't even look at pictures or videos of the ocean without feeling like I was going to hyperventilate. I didn't know what to do, so I turned to Google for answers. That's when I discovered thalassophobia, the fear of deep bodies of water or the ocean. I had no idea that was a thing, but as I read more about it, I realized that it described my symptoms perfectly. It was a relief to put a name to my fear, but it didn't make it go away. I tried to face my fear, to force myself to go swimming, or at least dip my toes in the water, but every time I did, it felt like I was putting my life in danger. The fear was just too strong. It's been a few years since that first experience, and while I've made some progress in overcoming my thalassophobia, it's still something that affects me to this day. I avoid going near large bodies of water as much as possible and still feel a twinge of fear whenever I see the ocean. It's strange to think that something as ordinary as water could hold such power over me, but that's just the way it is. I don't know if I'll ever fully conquer my phobia, but at least now I know that I'm not alone in my fear.